Ray, I'm going to turn to you next. What you need to know, Ray at the Danube Institute is our resident crusade guide. So he is the one who uses crusade in each and every one of his sentences. He's a historian by profession, and also I think, if I know that right, that you're a club Christian, if that's right. Could you maybe elaborate on how the history of Christian persecution has evolved in the past quite a few hundred years, let's be honest. This is not a new phenomenon. We are dealing with this issue today, which is sad that it's still something that we need to deal with. But maybe you could also highlight the fact that while Christian persecution exists, there's also a huge Muslim invasion that you talk a lot about in your podcast and your books. So could you maybe elaborate how those two things are interconnected and what's the historic view on this whole topic?
Sure, Zofia. Thanks. It's a very deep topic, and in fact, you do need the historical context to actually really understand what's going on. And as you touched upon it, in the middle, what we call today MENA or the Middle East and North Africa, which we take for granted has always been Islamic and Oriental. It was actually the older and more sophisticated and more advanced part of the Christian world, even more than Europe historically, before the Islamic conquest of the 7th century. So if you talked about Christendom in the 7th century, in the 600s, most of it was in North Africa and the Middle East, Turkey, what we call, what was known as Anatolia or Asia Minor. And of course, you had it in Europe too, southwest of the Danube and Rhine. But that was the more less advanced region. This is why Constantine moved the capital to what became Constantinople, Nova Roma, in the east. So that's and people are not aware of that. That's actually, if you look at the church fathers and all the early councils, it was all there in the east, in Egypt, in Syria, in Asia Minor. Augustine of Hippo, he was an Algerian, he was a Berber. So how did that change? Well, you had the 7th century Arab conquest, which swept through Egypt and the Middle East and all the way, and literally from the death of Muhammad, which is given in the year 632, until 732, 1 century later, 2/3 of what was Christendom was conquered permanently. And that would be North Africa, the Middle East, Egypt, Syria, Asia Minor, and also Spain. And I give the year 732 because that's the Battle of Tours, because now Islam is in the middle of France and it's finally halted there. Okay, so this was a cataclysmic event that is often not even acknowledged anymore in the official histories. And what's interesting is, and why I tell you all this is because we're talking about Christian persecution today, and you see the same dynamics and the same patterns actually begin then. And if you look at the actual sources, they're traced back to certain doctrines, certain Quranic verses like 929, the stipulations of Omar, which is a document that says Christians and Jews, people of the book, have to live according to certain standards. In short, they're not citizens. They're second-class subjects at best. They can't rebuild their churches. They can't build churches. They have to wear distinctive clothing. They have to pay a special tribute and feel themselves humbled and subdued, again, according to Quran 29. And they can't speak against Islam and blasphemy and all that sort of thing. I only tell you all that. I find it interesting because all of those dynamics are at work today, and most people don't understand the origin. And it's because of that that places like, let's say, Egypt, which was almost 100% Christian, is now 10%, because over the centuries, it was a chipping away at the Christian civilization in that region, and it got snuffed out entirely in other places. I told you of Augustine in Algeria. Well, Algeria now has literally no Christians and maybe less than 1%, but they're proselytized from Western sources. So they're kind of new Christians. They're not like the original indigenous Christians because they just disappeared. They became Muslims or died. So that's a summary of the history. And if you fast forward to today, like I'm saying, you will see all these dynamics in different capacities depending on the country we're talking about. So if you go to Nigeria, as it was mentioned, where according to a lot of human rights organizations, there's a genocide against the Christians. Boko Haram, a terrorist organization, but increasingly more so the Fulani tribesmen. And unfortunately, the media and the analysts try to make it sound like it has nothing to do with religion. They say the Fulani are basically herdsmen who are it's a land dispute. But then you find out all the herdsmen are Muslim and all the settled people are Christians. And if you talk to the Nigerians there, which I've done too, they tell you they come dressed in black, looking like ISIS, holding the Quran and screaming Allahu Akbar. So clearly it's a religious dimension for them. And there you have, I write a report, I've been writing it since 2011 every month, about the persecution of Christians. And Nigeria is by far the worst. But other sub Saharan African nations give it a run for its money, including Mozambique, Democratic Republic of Congo, other places. You have carnage, is what you have, like actual persecution, massacres. Just recently, they went into a church and found 70 Christians tied up and beheaded. Okay, so that sort of thing, that level is going on there. But and that would be, and they describe it, the Muslim or the jihadist groups, as a jihad. But then if you go to other areas which have a smaller amount, let's say Egypt or in the Arab world, where, like I said, you have 10% Christians, there it's more, it's entrenched. It's more discrimination. You still have outbursts of persecution, but what you have there is a sort of, it's like an Islamic law at work, but undercover, where everyone agrees to it, but not officially. So if you look at the Constitution of Egypt, Christians and Muslims have absolutely equal rights. In practice, that's not the case. So anytime Christians are perceived as somehow breaking Islam's rules for dhimmis, second-class citizens, let's say just last week, for example, they were trying to rebuild or fix a church, and so Muslims rose up in violence, attacked the Christians, burned the priest's car. I don't know if they killed anyone. Sometimes they do. And then what happens is the police wait for hours until the rioting ends, and then they come and they force the Christians into what's called a reconciliation session, which means they have to sit in the same room with the people who persecuted them until they agree to whatever the demands are. And before that, they actually arrested Christians who were attacked, and they held them hostage essentially until the Christian community signed away their rights. Then they let them go. Okay, so and then they talk about peace and tolerance. So that's what I mean. In different settings, you have different emanations or manifestations of Islamic law still alive and well. And even in places like Indonesia, which are often touted as very moderates, you see the same thing, where if a Christian wants to have a church, they want to go meet for Christmas, and then Muslims riot and throw bags of dung at them, and that sort of thing. And I also find it very telling that you see all these patterns in very different nations, which are ethnically and racially and linguistically different, economically different, governmentally different, but you see the same pattern. And like I said, if you dig deep, well, that pattern actually traces to what we were talking about historically and goes back to Islamic law. So that's also what makes it difficult to get rid of. It's part and parcel and entrenched to that particular religion. But so that basically is the summary of how we got here. And it's not something that would go away. So, for example, if you look at the top 10 worst nations where Christians are being persecuted, the number one is North Korea. But then the next nine, I think 8 of them are Muslim. And the problem is, so if you look at North Korea, there's actually a light at the end of the tunnel, because all you have to do is get rid of that regime, Kim Jong, and it will change. South Korea is actually pretty vibrantly Christian. But when you have these ingrained teachings in the doctrine embedded within a specific religion, that's why they've existed for so long, for well over a millennia. And that's what makes it very difficult to actually end and put an end to it. But unfortunately, the West is totally oblivious, as the other panelists pointed to it. This is the sorts of things that happen to Christians in the Islamic world in particular, but also elsewhere. But first, to really underscore what you said about, if the shoe was on the other foot, if Christians were doing this to Muslims, one of the most perfect examples, and since we've heard about the UN, comes from the UN. And just to show you how bad it is, so I think it's March 15th, 2019, you had what was called, it was a New Zealand attack on two mosques, where some, I think, Australian man went into two mosques and killed something like 50 Muslims. And because of that one solitary event, the UN decided to inaugurate on that date, March 15th, and to combat anti-Islamophobia Day. Okay, and it's like a major thing, and they talk about it, and they have panels, etc. So I did a quick study, and I about a year or two ago, and I looked at around the world where Muslims went into churches and killed Christians. And I ended up, I could have kept going for longer, but I came up with something like in a few years, 1,000 Christians around the world had been killed in numerous attacks on churches. And yet there's no day for that. There's no combat anti-Christianophobia. It's not even mentioned because, as we've heard, that happened because of climate change or something like that. Okay, so yeah, it's very obvious the double standards that are in play as far as what to do. And the what you were referencing, what I went through is basically in 2019 I was invited by the U.S. Army War College, very prestigious institution, to talk about history, to talk about one of my books, I think Sword and Scimitar, which looks at the centuries of warfare between Europe and Islam. And it made sense. It's a military organization and it's a military history, so everything's fine. But before long, all these activists, including what's known as CARE, it's Council on American Islamic Relations, but also these leftist activists, all bombarded the U.S. Army War College, calling me an Islamophobe, calling them white supremacists, shaming them and playing the guilt card. And before long, the U.S. Army War College, in fact, did rescind my invitation. They said, we'll postpone it. And but word got out. It made it into media what happened, and a lot of people got very angry. And 10 senators and congressmen wrote a letter to Trump. He was in office at the time, and a bunch of some various scholarly institutes also put out a petition. So it became a big deal, and it really embarrassed them. So then they contacted me to come back. And of course, I waited a few months to keep the heat on and keep embarrassing them.
As you should.
Yeah. And then I finally accepted. And when I went, of course, they ended up saying it's their largest event ever because of all the controversy. So I said, thanks,
That
Derek.
you do fool has.
Yeah, because of all the free publicity of what they did. But like you say, that right there is an example of how hard it is to get the truth out. It was just a simple lecture about history at a U.S. military academy, and just that was a big issue. It required a media reports and letters from congressmen and scholarly institutions and all this just to get a simple historical narrative about what we're talking about. So yeah, obviously we have a lot ahead of us and a lot of the idea. The bottom line is the people or the institutes or the elements in power do not like this topic, don't want to talk about it, don't want to acknowledge it even exists. Okay, this is why it's never on the media. I remember one time, if you recall, in 2000, I think it was 15 or 16 in February, where they beheaded 21 Coptic Christians in Libya, and it was videotaped. ISIS videotaped it. It was 20 Copts and one West African. And they did it because they would not renounce Christ and embrace Islam. That's what they said. And they videotaped it. That got a little media attention, but someone did a study, and right around the same time, a gorilla was killed in America accidentally, and that story got something like 10 times more coverage than 21 people losing their head because they don't want to renounce their religion. So obviously, there's a lot of dissembling going on, and that's the biggest problem. And like you said, it hits the academic world very early. So the people who are most, who undergo the education come out the most blind to this, and they perpetuate it, and so it becomes this kind of like niche thing that we're doing that no one really talks about, even though it's one of the biggest issues of our lifetime.
Thank you very much.